Part 1. The Toymaker's Secret. In the small, quiet town of Hartville, where every neighbor knew each other and gossip flowed as freely as the wind, lived a man who was both feared and pitied. He was known simply as the Toymaker, though few could remember his real name. His shop sat at the edge of town, its windows clouded with dust and age, and the sign above the door so weathered that it barely read Deacon's Dolls. Deacon had lived in Hartville all his life, but over the years he had become reclusive, a ghost of the man he once was. His only passion, it seemed, was crafting dolls, not just any dolls, but eerily lifelike creations. The townspeople marveled at how perfectly they resembled their human counterparts, down to the smallest details. The birthmarks, the moles, even the imperfections. But they also whispered behind closed doors about how unnatural the dolls seemed. Some claimed the dolls' eyes followed them as they passed the shop. Others swore they heard faint whispers when they stood near the windows. As Halloween approached, an unspoken dread filled the town. The holiday had always been Deacon's busiest season, and every year, new dolls would appear in the window, eerily lifelike, each one resembling someone from town. This year was no different. Click! The sound of Deacon's creaky door echoed across the empty street as he brought another doll to the front display. This one looked exactly like Rachel, the local baker's wife, right down to the flour smudge on her cheek. That night, the autumn wind howled through the streets, rattling windows and slamming shutters. Inside their homes, the townspeople bolted their doors and turned on their lights. Halloween was the next day, and though they couldn't explain why, an uneasy feeling settled in their hearts. Rachel's husband, Thomas, woke to the sound of knocking at their front door. The house was still, the clock on the wall ticking louder than usual in the silence of the night. Thomas glanced at the clock. 2:13 a.m. No one ever visited at this hour. He nudged Rachel, but she didn't stir. The knocking came again, louder this time. Reluctantly, Thomas rose from bed, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. As he approached the door, a cold draft slipped through the cracks, sending a shiver down his spine. He peered through the peephole and saw nothing. His hand hesitated on the knob, but the third round of knocks forced his hand. The door creaked open, revealing an empty porch bathed in moonlight. No one was there. He closed the door quickly, locking it behind him. But as he turned, his blood ran cold. At the end of the hall, standing in the dim light, was Rachel. Except, it wasn't. This thing looked like Rachel. Same face, same clothes, same everything, but its eyes were cold, lifeless, and a cruel smile stretched across its lips. And then it moved. Thomas blinked, his body frozen in terror as the figure started to walk towards him with slow, deliberate steps. He backed away, heart pounding in his chest, as the doll that looked like his wife reached out its hand, the joints of its fingers creaking like old wood. Rachel. His voice was barely a whisper. But it wasn't Rachel. He knew that now. It was one of Deacon's dolls. And it wanted something from him. The next morning, Thomas was gone. Rachel searched the house frantically, her calls to him echoing through the empty rooms. There was no sign of him, and the front door was still locked from the inside. Panicked, she ran to her neighbor's house, Julie, her breath coming in short gasps as she pounded on the door. Julie opened the door, her eyes wide with concern. Rachel, what's wrong? It's Thomas. He's gone. He was here last night, and now he's just gone. Julie's face paled, and she pulled Rachel inside, closing the door behind her. "You're not the only one. Paul didn't come home last night either. I called the police, but they said they couldn't do anything for at least 24 hours. People don't just vanish like this." The two women sat in the kitchen, the sound of the wind whistling outside making the house feel colder than it was. As they spoke in hushed tones, a knock at the door startled them both. They exchanged a glance before Julie hesitantly stood and approached the door. "Who is it?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. Her hand shook as she unlocked the door and pulled it open, revealing a figure standing on the porch. It was Paul. But something was wrong. His skin was pale, and his eyes, once full of warmth, were now hollow, glassy. Julie stepped back in horror as the figure took a step into the house, its movements stiff and unnatural. Rachel screamed as she realized what was happening. It wasn't Paul. It was another one of Deacon's dolls. That night, all across Hartville, the dolls came to life. Some knocked on doors. Others waited in the shadows, watching. The sound filled the town, echoing through the streets like a death knell. Inside their homes, people cowered, not daring to look out their windows. But it didn't matter. The dolls knew where to find them. Rachel and Julie barricaded themselves in the kitchen, stacking chairs and tables against the door. Outside, they heard the soft shuffle of footsteps and the faint creak of joints as the dolls gathered. Julie whimpered, clutching a knife to her chest as if it could save her from the terror outside. The door rattled, and the handle turned slowly, but the barricade held. For now. Then, the phone rang. Rachel jumped at the sound, her eyes wide with fear. She grabbed the phone from the counter, her hands shaking. "Hello," she whispered. No response. But she could hear something on the other end. Breathing. Then a voice, low and raspy, whispered,
"We're coming."
Part 3. The Toymaker's Curse. The entire town was under siege. The dolls had come for their human counterparts, one by one, with an uncanny purpose. Those who managed to survive the initial encounters sought shelter wherever they could, but there was a sense of inevitability, like they were trapped in a game they didn't understand. Rachel and Julie sat huddled in the dark, listening to the dolls outside their barricaded door. Every now and then, the floor creaked, or a distant knock sent waves of fear coursing through them. "What do they want?" Julie whispered. "Why is this happening?" "I don't know," Rachel replied, her voice hoarse from fear. But deep down, she had a suspicion. And it had everything to do with Deacon. "We have to go to the toy shop," Rachel said suddenly. "Deacon's dolls. He's behind this. He has to be." Julie stared at her in disbelief. "Are you insane? We'll never make it out there alive. We have to try. If we stay here, we're dead. They'll get in eventually." The air was thick with fear, but Rachel was right. They couldn't just wait to die. After a long, tense silence, Julie nodded. They gathered what little they could for protection, a kitchen knife, a metal pan, and made their way to the back door. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the dolls' shadowy figures could be seen moving through the mist. Their glassy eyes reflected the moonlight, and their stiff movements made the nightmarish scene even more surreal. The two women ran through the back alleys, dodging the eerie figures that stalked the streets. Click-clack, the sound of the dolls' stiff footsteps echoed behind them, always too close for comfort. At last, they reached Deacon's shop. The windows were dark, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking with every gust of wind. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and wood polish. They crept through the store, passing rows of dolls, each one a perfect replica of someone they knew. Some sat in chairs, their heads tilted in unnatural angles. Others stood behind the counter, their lifeless eyes staring into the void. And then, in the back room, they found Deacon. He was hunched over a workbench, surrounded by half-finished dolls, his hands working with a kind of frantic precision. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, glanced up when he saw them.
You shouldn't have come here.
"What are you doing?" Rachel demanded, her voice shaking with rage and fear. "What have you done to them?" Deacon's lips curled into a sinister smile.
I have given them life. I have given them purpose.
Part 4. The Horrors Within. The dim light in Deacon's workshop flickered ominously, casting long shadows over his gnarled face. Rachel and Julie stood frozen, staring at the old man who had haunted their nightmares for years. "What do you mean, given them life?" Julie spat, her voice trembling with fury. "Those things, they're killing people." Deacon tilted his head, as though considering the accusation, his wrinkled face expressionless.
I didn't mean for it to happen this way, but sometimes creation, they take on a life of their own.
Rachel stepped forward, heart pounding. "Then stop it. End this." Deacon sighed and looked at the dolls around him, their blank faces watching.
I can't. It's too late. They have taken on the souls of the people they resemble. They are your neighbors now in every way.
Julie let out a small, horrified gasp. "You're lying." "No," Deacon said, standing slowly, his frail form casting a long shadow on the wall.
When I made them, I poured all of my loneliness into them. They were supposed to keep me company, be my family, but the magic went wrong. Instead of being my companions, they needed more. They needed to replace.
The sound of scraping would fill the room, and Julie turned to see one of the dolls slowly rising from the floor. Its head jerked sideways with an audible crack, its glassy eyes locking onto hers. "They're here," Rachel whispered, backing toward the door. But the dolls were everywhere now, emerging from the shadows, their lifeless eyes gleaming in the dim light. They moved stiffly, jerkily, their limbs creaking as they closed in on the women. Deacon just watched, his face a mask of indifference.
There is no stopping them now.
Rachel grabbed Julie's arm and pulled her toward the door. "We have to go now." They ran from the shop, slamming the door behind them. But the dolls were relentless. Their footsteps clicked in unison as they pursued, their wooden limbs clattering against the pavement. The streets of Hartville had become a battleground of unspeakable horror. Lifelike dolls with glassy, unblinking eyes moved with eerie precision, their stiff limbs creaking with every step. They hunted their human counterparts, tracking them down with an uncanny sense of purpose. Those who hadn't yet been replaced barricaded themselves inside their homes, but deep down, everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the dolls found their way in. Fear hung over the town like a suffocating blanket, and escape seemed impossible. Rachel and Julie ran through the empty streets, their breaths ragged as the sound of clicking footsteps echoed behind them. The dolls were close. Too close. "We need to get to the church," Rachel shouted over the wind, her voice barely audible above the howling gusts. "Father Michael, he can help us." Julie nodded, her face pale with terror. Neither of them knew how much longer they could keep running. The dolls never tired, their movements relentless and unnerving. The church loomed ahead, its tall steeple barely visible through the swirling mist. It felt like a beacon of hope in a town overrun by nightmare, but hope was quickly fading. As they approached, the doors creaked open, and Father Michael stood in the doorway, his face gaunt and grim, yet determined. "Get inside," he urged, pulling them in just as the dolls reached the church steps. The heavy doors slammed shut, and Father Michael bolted them quickly, though the look on his face said he knew it was only a temporary defense. Inside, the church was dimly lit, the flickering candles casting twisted shadows across the stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of wax and dust, but beyond the sanctuary, the only thing that could be heard was the relentless thud of the dolls outside. The sound of their fists against the wood was rhythmic, almost mechanical. Julie's voice was barely above a whisper. "They'll break through." Father Michael crossed himself, his eyes filled with a grim determination. "There's only one way to stop this." Rachel's stomach twisted. "Deacon." Father Michael nodded. "He created them. He's tied to them, bound in ways even he may not fully understand. If we sever that connection, if we end his life, the dolls will fall." Rachel exchanged a glance with Julie, her heart sinking. It was unthinkable, but what choice did they have? The knocking grew louder, the door rattling on its hinges as the dolls pressed against it, determined to get in. "We'll have to make a stand," Father Michael said, his voice steady but low. "Whatever happens, we can't let them get to him." But Rachel wasn't so sure. There was something about this plan, something about Deacon himself, that filled her with a growing sense of dread. The night dragged on, the sounds of scraping wood, creaking hinges, and thudding footsteps filling the church as the dolls tried to break through. Rachel, Julie, and Father Michael stood ready, armed with knives and crosses. Their hearts raced, each creak of the door pushing them closer to the brink of terror. The candles burned lower, their flickering flames casting twisted shadows on the walls. Outside, the dolls moved in a cold, calculating pattern, trying different points of entry, testing the structure of the church. Their glassy eyes, gleaming in the moonlight, betrayed no emotion, only the cruel mimicry of life. Father Michael whispered a prayer under his breath, but Rachel could see the doubt in his eyes. Even he wasn't sure if they could hold out until dawn. And then, with a final crack, the doors burst open. The dolls swarmed in, their movements stiff, jerky, but purposeful. There were so many of them. Too many. For a moment, time seemed to freeze as Rachel, Julie, and Father Michael stared at the advancing horde, their glassy eyes reflecting the candlelight in eerie, empty gleams. "Now!" Father Michael shouted. They sprang into action. Father Michael swung his cross like a weapon, the edge cracking against the first doll's head, sending it stumbling backward. Rachel slashed with her knife, cutting through the porcelain-like flesh of another doll. But no blood came, just the hollow sound of tearing fabric. Julie fought beside them, her eyes wild with fear, her hands shaking as she stabbed at the lifeless things. But for every doll they cut down, another took its place, rising from the shadows, their limbs creaking as they moved forward. Rachel's heart pounded as she fought, but there was something wrong, something she hadn't noticed at first. The dolls. They weren't falling like they should. Their stiff movements, once jerky and slow, were becoming smoother, more fluid, as if they were adapting, learning. Suddenly, one of the dolls caught Julie's wrist. She screamed, trying to pull away, but its grip was unnaturally strong. Its head jerked sideways, its lifeless eyes locking onto hers, and with a sickening crack, it twisted her arm. Rachel rushed to help, but two more dolls grabbed Julie from behind, dragging her to the ground. "Julie!" Rachel screamed, her voice breaking with panic. Father Michael lunged forward, his cross raised, but the dolls were faster. They swarmed him, pulling him down with mechanical precision. His prayers turned to desperate screams as they closed in, their cold, unfeeling hands grasping his limbs. Rachel slashed at the dolls, her movements wild and frantic, but it was too late. The church was filled with the sound of scraping wood, the dolls' limbs creaking as they tightened their grip on Father Michael and Julie. Rachel backed away, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but there was nowhere to run. She was alone. The dawn was nearing, and with it, a sense of impending doom. The first light began to creep through the church windows, casting an eerie glow over the scene. But instead of bringing hope, it only illuminated the horror. Rachel stumbled backward, her knife slipping from her trembling hand as she watched the dolls overwhelm Father Michael and Julie. Their struggles slowed, their screams muffled by the relentless pressure of the dolls' cold hands. And then, in a moment of chilling clarity, Rachel realized something. They weren't just killing them. They were replacing them. She watched in horror as the dolls began to change, their stiff limbs smoothing out, their glassy eyes flickering with something new, something human. The dolls that had once been lifeless were becoming animated, filled with an unnatural energy, their jerky movements becoming more fluid, more real. And Father Michael. Julie. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she saw the transformation take place. The dolls that had once been Julie and Father Michael were standing now, their movements precise, calculated. Their eyes, once filled with fear, were now cold, lifeless. Perfect replicas. "No," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. But there was no escape. The dolls, her friends, turned their lifeless eyes toward her, and Rachel knew what was coming. She backed into the altar, her legs shaking, her mind racing for a way out. But there was no way out. The dolls had won. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the dolls closed in on her, their cold hands reaching out, their eyes reflecting the dim light like mirrors. Rachel felt their grip tighten around her arms, her legs, pulling her down. She screamed, but it was swallowed by the silence of the church. Hartville had fallen. By the time the sun rose fully over the town, the streets were empty. The dolls had completed their work, moving with eerie precision from house to house, replacing each and every one of Hartville's residents with their perfect, lifeless counterparts. There was no resistance anymore. No panic. No fear. Only silence. In the church, the candles had long since burned out, leaving the sanctuary in darkness. Father Michael, Julie, and Rachel stood side by side at the altar, their eyes glassy, their movements stiff and mechanical. They were no longer themselves, no longer human. They were dolls. And outside, the town continued its quiet existence, the people, if they could still be called that, moving about their daily routines as if nothing had changed. But beneath their porcelain skin, beneath their hollow, glassy eyes, there was no life, only the cruel mockery of it. Hartville was saved. But it wasn't the people who had been saved. It was the dolls. And as the town settled into the stillness of the morning, the sound of clicking footsteps echoed through the empty streets. The dolls were always watching, always waiting, and soon they would need more.